Welcome to Positive Talk with Kevin McDonald. Hey, that's me. Hi, and welcome to Positive Talk. Our show features the best positive stories and people from around the globe as we endeavor to answer the universal question of why am I here and what is my purpose? Understanding that can change everything, and knowing your greatness is fundamental to living your best life. So join us right now as together we work to create the adventure of our lifetime. And welcome to the show, everybody. We have a gentleman who has written about the adventure of his family's lifetime, and his name is Michael G. Bergen, and he's an author of a group of books. There are 4 of them. 3 are out. 1 is coming out, and it is about they're historical. I don't know if you call them historical novels or biographies or a combination of the two, but Michael is here, and he's had a really unique and wonderful life all by himself. So let's talk to him right now. Michael, welcome to the show. It's so great to see you today.
Thanks, Kevin. It's great seeing you too.
And so tell me a little bit about yourself, because you became an author a little bit later in life.
I did. Much too late.
Well, but that you wanted to do it from an early time on.
Exactly. I wanted to do it from the time I was in university. And I got distracted by raising a family and having to make a living. And I ended up in computer research and in computer marketing and all sorts of things. But my life started in England, and it started 2 years before the end of World War II. Actually, in a place called Croydon. I don't know if you know it, but it's now basically southern London. At the time, it was an independent city, but now it's southern London. In fact, the international airport during the war was out of Croydon. So I was born there. My father was a Canadian soldier who had spent 3 years in England. Met my mother, who was a British woman. And just before he left to go to Italy to fight in the Italian campaign, as it was called, I was born. And so he went off and had to contend with the war in Italy. And it was quite a nasty 2 years, in fact. It took 2 years to push the Germans out of Italy and conquer that. And then but meanwhile, I was under pressure also because Croydon was being attacked by the vengeance weapons, as the Germans called them, the V1 and the V2 rockets. I don't know if you know anything about those, but the V1 rocket was also called the buzz bomb, or there was another name for it. I'm trying to remember it. Anyway, these things would come in and they would make a noise, and then when the noise stopped, they would drop, and everybody would drop their whatever they were doing and run for cover. And a cousin of mine and I were thrown under the table at least one point, and followed by our mothers and what have you, because the bomb was coming down. What was worse later on was the V2, which was an actual ICBM. It was an intercontinental ballistic missile that went much faster than the speed of sound. You couldn't see it or anything. It was very, very quick. And it had an explosion that would wipe out an entire city block. Anyway, that was the environment that I sort of grew up in as a child, as a baby. And then the war ended, and I flew with my mother 2 days after the end of the war to Montreal, which was my father's city. And he came a couple of months later, and that's where I grew up. I grew up in Montreal, went to school there, went to university there. I joined the Royal Canadian Navy. So I was in the Navy during the Cold War, and that's where I first started experiencing that particular conflict. Because the Canadian Navy wasn't officially involved with the Cold War, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we were also looking out for submarines, checking fishing trawlers in the Grand Banks of Canada to see if they had any missiles on board, that sort of thing. So that went on for a while, and fortunately, nothing happened. We came very close to a very serious conflict there, the World War III. But I don't know whether you know this. There was off the southern United States. There was a Soviet submarine, and it had on board a nuclear missile, and they were about to release it, but they required a quorum of all of their officers to agree that it should be released, and only one officer refused to give permission to release it. So they didn't release it. If that had gone, then we would have definitely been in World War III. So that was one little incident. And then I also got involved. Our ship was sent out to try to find any kind of flotsam or indication of the most advanced American submarine of the time, which had gone into it was called the USS Thresher. It had gone into a deep dive while it was being tested off of Massachusetts, and it never came out of the dive. It just kept on going down to the bottom, imploded, and 129 men on board were killed. But we spent a few days out there at the request, I assume, of the American Navy, trying to see some sort of indication to see whether there was anything on the surface. And it was a very, very sobering experience, believe me. When you're a sailor and you know that a ship has gone down and you're looking for it, it's a very sobering experience. Anyway, that came to an end. They eventually found where it was on the bottom, and all the men on board died, sadly.
We know what was interesting about that particular thing was that it had a leak in the engine room.
Yeah.
And that because of the technology that they had at that time, this is 1963, and the technology that they had at that time was not perfect. And so the systems were tied together. And when that particular system got flooded, it shut down all the systems in the entire boat. And
right.
So
including the reactor.
Correct. And so it could not surface.
Correct.
And so it ended up going down. And ladies and gentlemen, picture, if you will, you're in a boat, you're in a submarine, and you know that you've got a depth that you cannot go below. And if you do, the pressure of the ocean is going to cause there to be problems up to and including the boat collapsing on itself.
Yeah.
And so they knew that was happening as the boat was going down. So what a horrible thing for those 129 men to I assume they're all men at that time.
Terrible.
You know.
Yeah, as you say, there were warnings. I mean, there were pipes leaking and what have you. And of course, as it gets deeper and deeper, the hull starts to creak and starts booming in a little bit and what have you. It must have been horrifying. But the actual death took 1/10 of a second. The implosion took less than a tenth of a second. So it was instantaneous. So from that point of view, I suppose, and there was nothing left of the men on board. I mean, when that happens, there's nothing left of them. So I suppose that is something of a consolation.
Yeah. Well, and I want to ask you, because you were born in 43.
Yeah.
And grew up. And by the way, I just wanted to touch base with the the VF1. Which was, it had a motor in it, and as long as the motor was going, you were okay.
Correct.
It was when the motor stopped.
Yep.
And so people would be standing there listening to the motor go overhead, and if it kept on going, you were going to be fine. But if it stopped, over you, that's when you were in big trouble.
That's exactly it. Yeah, it was just a funny little motor. It sort of had a putting sound to it, put, 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 so it sounded very innocuous. But you're right. The moment that the motor stopped, they knew that it was going to fall, and then they were worried about where it was going to end up landing. And that apparently happened a couple of times in the home where I was living in Croydon.
And in those days, they did not have what you would call smart bombs. They didn't have computers on them so that they knew exactly
No.
where they were going to end up. They
Yeah.
just wound it up, and then wherever it stopped, and so it was just the luck of the draw.
That's right. That's right. And Croydon took a lot of hits because eventually the British government started sending erroneous messages and what have you that gave the Germans the impression that they had to actually fall further south and that they were maybe going too far to hit London. So they actually moved the distances further south. So Croydon being south of London, and of course the countryside of Kent and what have you, started receiving a lot of these bombs as a result of that. So yeah, it was quite a time of for everybody. You know, over 30,000 Londoners died in that war, in the Blitz, sorry, and in the bombings, the V1, V2 bombings. So it was quite harsh.
Well, and I remember watching the movie The Battle of Britain, which was about the RAF, the Royal Air Force, and how they were able to stop the Germans from bombing everybody into oblivion.
Yep.
But let's talk more about you and so you grew up and were in the Navy and stuff. What made you decide to write? Number one, to write, and number two, to develop this the Rutherford Chronicles.
Okay, yeah. First of all, to write, when I was studying at university, I studied in Montreal. I did a number of projects, a number of papers, and got very high marks on them and what have you. And I started taking an interest in writing. And at that time, I actually started writing a bit of poetry, not very good, not bad poetry, but anyway, and wrote a couple of short stories and what have you. So I decided at that time of my life that I wanted to write. But I got married, and we went to Europe. And we were only going to it was only going to be a gap year. We were only going to spend a year there, traveling around Europe. I had family in England. My wife at the time had family in Germany. So we thought we'd go and spend some time with them. And then we ended up staying. We stayed, I got a job with the scientific center in Heidelberg, Germany, with IBM. And spent years there, 7 years there. Our children came along. You know how it is, and all the time I had to keep bringing home the bread, so I didn't get around to doing. I did some writing. I did some research, did some writing, but not a great deal. And then I went to Paris. IBM sent me to Paris for 3 years. And it was the same thing. We got all caught up in Paris. I loved Paris. Did a lot of traveling. Went to all the museums, art galleries, restaurants, everything we could do. So that was wonderful. And then after that, I accepted an assignment. It was supposed to be a 3-year assignment to South Africa. So I went down in 1983, supposedly for 3 years, and ended up just kind of staying there. I don't know. South Africa is a little bit like, I'm trying to think of the United States, I guess like a little bit like Arizona and Colorado in a way. It's warm and it has an opposite climate to, it's opposite to the Northern Hemisphere, obviously. Right now, for example, they're going into their autumn. And it has a wonderful climate. And so I ended up getting stuck there, to make a long story short. But going back to Germany and the Cold War, I just want to come back to that for a moment, because when we first arrived there, we went first of all to Iceland and visited some friends in Iceland. Then we went on to Germany, and we went to a city in the north of Germany called Lübeck. And Lübeck at the time was right on the border between East and West Germany. In fact, it virtually cut through the outer side of the city, and there's a kind of a resort or a beach resort there, close to Lubeck, which is the mouth at the mouth of a river. And we would go down there. We arrived in summer, went down there to see it and what have you. And then there was a fence, just a simple fence with some signs on it saying "Stay away," stay out, and saying that there were minefields on the other side of this fence. And then our relatives who were there took us a little bit further up the river, and we there experienced the fence. Basically, it wasn't a wall in Germany. It only became a wall in Berlin. It was just a fence, but it had this field beyond it, and sand field, which had mines in it. So if you went beyond a certain point, you could get blown up by a mine. Now, this was in what am I thinking of? 1968. 1968. That's where the Cold War was in full steam, going through it. I had experienced the 1962-63 instances in the Atlantic, and also I went to for the first time. I went to West Berlin, sorry, in 1963 from the Navy. It was a special trip. We were invited by the mayor of Berlin at the time, who was Willy Brandt. I don't know if you know that name. Willy
Sure.
Brandt later became the Chancellor of Germany.
Yeah.
So he invited not only from us, but people from all over the world. He wanted people to come to see what the divided Germany was like, and to go back home and to say what a horrible place it is. We got to end this East-West business. And so I experienced the Cold War, if you like, in Lubeck, on the right on the sea, and then in East Berlin, in Berlin. Sorry, the first time I went, I couldn't go into the east, but I went once more about 10 years later, and we could go into East Berlin, and that was a bit of a shocker because it was a very dismal place. You come from West Berlin was a vibrant city. With everything you expect, restaurants and bistros and shopping centers and all that kind of thing, shopping malls. And you go into the East Berlin side, it was almost dead. We actually went for a meal there, but we had to go into a cafeteria, and it wasn't a great meal. But also we had been warned, for example, not to make any money exchanges, because the East Berliners always wanted to get West Berlin marks because they were worth a lot more than their marks. They told us not to do that, otherwise we'd be arrested. So we had that hanging over our heads,
Well, Michael, I want to, because there are lots of folks, because I'm thinking about 1980, or 1983, which was 40 years ago. And
Yeah.
There are lots of people that are younger that may not have studied history at all. And I want to kind of bring them up to date
Yes.
on East and West Germany, how that came to be, along with the same thing happened in North Korea and South Korea and North Vietnam and South Vietnam. But
Correct.
what happened was that during World War II, the Russians came from the East, and the United States, France, and Britain came from the West. And we were going to meet in Berlin. Well,
Yep.
the Russians got there first. And
Correct.
so they took Berlin, and then we entered, because we had to fight the Battle of the Bulge and certain things. So they didn't make it quite as far. And so there was a negotiation that happened.
Correct.
And even though Berlin was in Eastern Germany, and they carved up the city, so it would be West Berlin and East Berlin. But West Berlin was still an isolated city within Eastern Germany.
It was an island.
Yes, exactly. And
so
so that was the negotiation that happened between Russia and the Allies. Was they carved up Germany about halfway in between.
Yep.
And so Berlin ended up being part free and part communist. and the
Correct.
communist regime was not very nice to its people, and so that's why the difference was in West Berlin and East Berlin. If you want to look at history and go back to 1961 or so, when John Kennedy said, "Ich bin ein Berliner."
Lena, yep. I was there the day after.
Oh,
The day after that speech.
see, so you've got some enormous amounts of history of stuff
Yeah.
that I really think it's important, because World War One, a catastrophe, World War Two, a bigger catastrophe. We've
Correct.
had the Boer War, which you write about in your first book, was not as big, but it was still an empire going to another country in the olden way that they used to do
Yep.
things.
Yep.
And so your the Rutherford Chronicles, as you so aptly described it, it's a normal family that's caught up in abnormal historical events all over.
Exactly. Exactly. And all of this background that you've just given is all covered in detail in my memoir. So I cover it right from the very beginning, because the Cold War started virtually at the end of World War II, 1945 already. And it wasn't only, of course, Germany, because everything beyond that, the whole of Eastern Europe was in Russian hands. So there was East and West Germany, but there was also Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary. All of those countries were all in, under the influence of Stalin, who was in charge at the time. He was the premier of the Soviet Union, and he was a very harsh ruler. It was all under his control. So I cover all of that.
Yeah, and Michael, I just want to point this out. You know what's interesting about that is that people who don't understand the history between Russia and its satellite countries in Eastern Europe,
yes,
don't understand why Russia now is going after Ukraine. But
correct.
Ukraine used to be a satellite of Russia, and the Russian Empire, which at that time was called the USSR. It's told that he wants to reestablish the USSR in those borders, which includes a lot of the satellite countries, which is why
that's right. That's
supposedly one of the reasons why he's going after Ukraine is they were, and there are a lot of Russian-speaking people still to this day in Ukraine.
In Ukraine, that's right, absolutely right. But also, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Finland was also part of the Russian Empire and the USSR. They broke. Finland got away from it a lot earlier, but it had been part of the Russian Empire, and of course, all of the other countries, satellite countries. I think there were 19 countries that were part of the USSR.
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that.
So have you been to Finland?
Oh yes, I've been to Finland.
I have a friend of mine who lives there, and he tells me, and it all stems from the Cold War and from World War II, but he tells me that they have a significant underground presence, that they've got huge places underground where many people can go. They've even got a Olympic-sized swimming pool in one, and shopping centers and stuff like that, because they have always been concerned that Russia would come back and take them and take over.
Yeah,
and
that's interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting how the history blends itself into so many different things in so many different countries from their perspective and stuff. It really is fascinating.
It really is.
So I really applaud you with the books that you've written, because the World War II, now we've got 3 books that are out now: Empire Discovered, Empire in War, and Empire in Tyranny, which covers the Boer War, World War I, and World War II. But you've also got a book that's coming out very soon.
That's right, on the Cold War.
Yes, and we're going to talk about that when we come back. We're talking with Michael Bergen, and stay with us. This is just going to be 30 seconds, so don't.
Sure, no problem. Yep.
have your eyes. They have your ears. They have your smile. Now all they need is a little more of your time. Make a difference in your child's life, because anyone can be a father. It takes time to be a dad.
Very nice.
And welcome back to Positive Talk with Kevin McDonald. And we're talking with Michael Bergen. He is an author. He's got 3 books out, and 1 book is being birthed as we speak. And it's pretty much all done. And it's about his life during the Cold War when he was in the Canadian service, and he took part in the Cuban Missile Crisis and the sinking of the submarines and that whole time frame, which had to be really interesting for you.
Yeah, no, it really was. It really was. And then what happened was, I was telling you, I moved at one point to Paris with IBM, and I was asked to go down to South Africa to give a presentation to one of the largest mining companies down there, and just to check on a project that they were doing down there, because I had been involved in some big projects while I was in research at IBM. And so I went down there with my then wife and fell in love with the country. But of course, in those days, it was still under the power of under European or white power, under what they called the apartheid system.
Yeah.
But while I was there, I talked to a lot of executives, and they all gave me the impression, and in fact, a lot of them actually almost promised me that apartheid was going to end very soon, and that there was, that they all sort of realized that the system had to come to an end, and that it wouldn't take long. So in 1983, I decided on the basis of that to go down for 3 years. With my family. I took my wife, my children. We went down there. We lived in Johannesburg for a while, and got involved in the country and loved it. I mean, we did traveling to all the game reserves, and it was just, it's a wonderful country. The climate's wonderful. The game reserves are amazing, and all the rest of it. And then we decided to stay, and I started a company. And that company grew, prosperous. And while I was doing that, I also got involved in a nonprofit organization that tried to convince, just backing up 1 second, when by that time, blacks were going to university, especially the ones that came from middle-class black families. Their fathers were doctors or lawyers or whatever, politicians and the like. They were going to university or going to high school, doing well, and then wanted to go to colleges, but they all wanted to go into the soft professions. They all wanted to be doctors, lawyers, politicians, and so on. So I got involved with an organization that was actually sponsored by a couple of engineering organizations down there, NGOs, and they financed it. And we were trying to convince kids to go into technical degrees, so to become engineers, and to go into information technology, which I was involved in. And this organization was called ProTech, and it was run by a woman, an Afrikaans woman, white Afrikaans woman. But it was a great organization, and they even supported the children coming out of the townships by giving them food and also teaching them how to become, let's say, how to blend into a business environment. So taught them just life skills in the very, very beginning, giving them life skills, trying to make them understand that they would have to dress properly going into a company and all those kind of things. And then eventually supported them through high school. So through giving them tutoring in mathematics and those kinds of things. and all the time trying to convince them, softly, of course, to consider an engineering profession. So I did that for a while, and that was really, really fantastic. And in the process of doing that, that was right when Nelson Mandela was released from prison. And we had one occasion, which was very interesting. It was a sort of a social affair, but Nelson Mandela and Winnie, his wife, came to our session, and we all met him, shook his hand, talked to him. He was just straight out of prison, so he wasn't the giant politician that we would come to know. He was a very quiet man in those days, very, unassuming and what have you. But it was just an honor to meet him. And I met other important people in terms of, in the Black community in South Africa. So that was, the lead up, if you like. I was involved in the lead up to the elections. And when the elections happened, I became, almost emotional. And that was after the end of that was well after the end of the Cold War, which was another emotional time for me. I mean, seeing the wall come down, seeing the end of communism in Europe and the opening up of Europe, all of those things I lived through. And all of that comes into my fourth book. So the whole history, my whole history of how in my youth, how I was preparing for a military type of career, all the way through my youth, and then into the Navy, and even in my studies, becoming involved in economics and during the Cold War time, and looking to a future in economics. So that's all in my fourth book, which is now being basically printed as we speak. It should be out in the next week or two. But that's just the fourth book. I mean, that's the last book of the series. I don't know if you want me to. Should I move back and introduce the entire why I got into writing and what have you? I guess that you wanted me to talk about that.
Yeah, we did. So, but first I need to take a station break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about that. But I just wanted to mention, did you ever see the movie Forrest Gump?
Forrest Gump, yes.
The premise of Forrest Gump was he was a simple man in the South, but he, due to circumstances really mostly beyond his control, he kept running into all of these important people,
yes,
like JFK and Lyndon Johnson and stuff. Your story and the story of the four books could easily fit into that mold of how simple men were thrust into huge issues and wars and things and how you survived all of that. And that would be, I was just thinking of that as like the day you met Nelson Mandela would be, that would be one of those rare moments that most people don't ever get.
Yeah.
And that's really cool. By the way, we're talking with Michael Bergen, and he's got 3 books out called the Rutherford Chronicles, part 1, 2, and 3. And the 4th book is at the printer, as they say, and will be out very quickly. We need to take a quick station break, and we'll be right back. You're listening to Positive Talk with Kevin McDonald.
You're listening to Brushwood Media Network, the best in syndicated talk, news, and entertainment shows.
As you go about your daily life, look closer. As you gather with family and friends who love and support you, look closer. There are youth right in your community who don't have the home, warmth, and healing you have. So look closer. Every year across America, a staggering 4.2 million youth are homeless or trafficked. And for 50 years, Covenant House has worked relentlessly to keep them safe and protected. Tonight, 2,000 young people will sleep safely in a Covenant House bed. And tomorrow, they will wake up surrounded by love. They get clean clothes, hot meals, medical care, and a safe place to sleep. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In sites across America to help them fulfill the great promise of their lives. So look closer at Covenant House. To help or get help, go to covenanthouse.org.
And welcome back to Positive Talk with Kevin McDonald. Hey, we've got a great author for you today and a great series of books. If you are into history at all, like I am, I'm real excited about getting these books because it blends history and also through the eyes of the simple folks that we all are at one point. So it's like in the Boer War, the book one, he's talking about a family member that was in the British Army, and when he was down in I can't remember what country it was, but it was in Africa somewhere.
South Africa.
South Africa, yeah. And the Boer War, which was the old way of fighting, and then World War I, which was trench warfare and gas and all that kind of stuff, and then World War II, and then the Cold War. So all of these books have got a lot of history to them. You've done a tremendous amount of research, and so you should be very proud of that.
Yep.
Was it fun for you to do all that much research?
Oh yeah. Oh, I loved it. That's the other thing that I started in university. I got very into doing research, formal research, and that's what started it.
And so you ended up having a successful career in with Microsoft and in several other companies, and one of which was yours. And then what did you decide at one point that you wanted to retire, and so you sold your company? Is that what happened?
Correct. Yes. And it's about that time later in my career, but in fact, as you say, sort of thinking about retirement, I knew from a very early age in life that my grandfather had fought in the Boer War. And I didn't even know where South Africa was, but I understood that he had fought in the Boer War in Africa somewhere, and that he had been a prisoner of war during the First World War. My father, I knew, had been a Canadian soldier in the Second World War. So what happened was I got interested in looking a little bit more into my family history as I was sort of winding down from my business career. And I started doing a little bit of research. I started doing genealogical research. In other words, just looking at lineage, my ancestors, where they came from, and so on. And I had Scottish ancestry, largely Scottish ancestry, on both my mother's side and my father's side. So I looked into all of that. And then I'd always been also, even as a boy, growing up, like many boys, I'm interested in the army and in fighting and all that kind of stuff. I mean, we shouldn't be into that, but we do get interested in it. And I started looking into that, into the military aspects of my ancestors' lives in particular. And that's where I started doing my research right in the very beginning on the Boer War. I read about 20 different books. I've got them all still here, learning how the whole thing came about, which was, as you mentioned earlier on, basically the British Empire got terribly interested in South Africa because it had diamonds and it had gold. Right. Lots of diamonds, lots of gold. In fact, it was the richest country in the world from that perspective at that time. And so the British Empire at some point decided they were going to take over there. The problem was there were the two of the provinces. The British were already in the Cape, which is the southernmost tip of South Africa, and they were in another province, which was called Natal. They were already in there, and there were two republics that were run by the Boers. One was called the Orange Free State, which was right in the center of South Africa, and the other one was called the South African Republic, which was in the north. And so they went in and they started, the negotiations started and fell apart and what have you. And the Boers decided that the British were being too arrogant and said, okay, we're not going to let you in through our borders. So they went around to all of the main centers around the borders, and they put their what they call commandos, their soldiers, to block any British from coming in. And that really upset the British, being the British Empire was the largest empire that had ever existed at the time. And they decided then to go to war. And the war started. So I went into it in a lot of detail. My grandfather had always wanted to get involved in the army, and he joined up a little bit later. He joined up when he was 19, went through training, and he was sent down to South Africa on a ship. And I covered all of that. I got into real detail as to not only about what was happening within the Boer War, but also how my grandfather joined and how he got to South Africa and where he actually traveled through South Africa. So I learned that through, number one, the papers he signed right up front, which told me also where he was working before he joined. He was in the shipyards. At that time, he was in a city in the northeast of England called Jarrow, which is right across from Newcastle. And that area was a very big shipbuilding area. It was, first of all, coal mining and then shipbuilding, heavy industry and what have you. So I looked into all of that, and out of that created this first book. How he, first of all, got involved, how he went down to South Africa, and then his movement within South Africa, all the way from Cape Town, all the way up to the north of the province of South Africa, where they finally, the British finally won the war, and the Boers sort of capitulated, and South Africa became basically a colony of the whole of South Africa became a colony of the British Empire, which
was a continuation of.
So that was the first one. And after, as it happens, and I've added this on, if you like, as a British soldier, he was sent to India, not to a war. It was just he did duty in India. So I followed him through India, all the way through India, and then back to where he lived in the northeast of England. So that's the first book. Then he went back to his old job, and time passed. He ended up meeting his wife, married, had 2 children, and then along comes the First World War. This was in August 1914, and he was in the reserve. So they called up the reserve. So he didn't join. He was basically brought into the army and sent after training again to France into the trenches. But he only spent a very short time in the trenches, and it was a very vicious time. It was a terrible time, with a lot of people being killed, a lot of soldiers being killed, not only in the trenches, but also in what they called the race to the sea, where they were trying to block the Germans off from getting into France and getting to Paris. After 1 month and 1 day, he was captured by the Germans. Near Lille, sort of in the north of France, and sent to he went through 3 prisoner of war camps in northern Germany. So you want to say something, Kevin?
Nope, I'm good. Go ahead.
Am I okay? So he went through, I did, first of all, they didn't know, my family didn't know where he had been as a prisoner of war, but I found the International Red Cross has records that started in World War I of every prisoner that was taken, and every camp that they were sent to, they filled in a form, which had their name, had the unit, the regiment they belonged to, the unit, and everything else. So it was very carefully documented by the International Red Cross all the way through the war, all the way since right up to today, I assume. So I was able to follow through that, and then I was able to do, through my research into the camps, know where they were, know how they were run, and know what the men ate, which was very, very little. And so they all started losing weight, getting weaker and weaker. And then along came the 1918 flu, and that killed many. In In fact, you know that the 1918 flu, which they also called the Spanish flu wrongly, started in the United States. It started in army camps in the United States and was transported with the soldiers to the front, the Western Front. And it was devastating. I mean, it killed millions of people, millions of civilians, millions of soldiers. And it got into the camps, the prisoner of war camps. And, he almost died there. By that time, later in the war, there was very little food, even for the Germans. As the war came to an end, even the Germans were starving because they couldn't get their hands on enough food. Germany ran out of funds. So that was it. That was the World War I story. And then eventually he did he lived through to the end and found his way back with the help of the army back to Northern England. So that was book 2. Yeah. That was book 2. That's the whole story.
And then book 3 is about your father and World War II.
Correct. Well, it starts off with my grandfather, because when they went back to a very different England in 2 ways. Number one, England was a lot poorer, and it went through the Great Depression, which the British called the Great Slump. So it went through all of that, and that's the time also when Hitler came to power, because Germany was going through the same sort of things. And Hitler came to power, and I write about that as well. Yeah. And then, yes, when World War II started, my father joined immediately. And that's a theme that runs through all of my books. And it ended even with me, that we always talk about how terrible wars are. But with each war, when it starts, all the young men, and now the young women as well, would run to the recruitment offices, join up, and go over to get killed. Millions of them. Well, this is a theme that runs through all of my books. It was always the same. Every generation, every war, every generation, it was the young people that joined up, went to war, and died.
Well, and that's because of I think, you tell me, isn't that because of the romanticization?
Yes.
We make war sound like a wonderful thing, and I can only tell you that if I were in that age, and you think you're invincible when you're that age anyway, and so then you go and you're in the trenches and you're about ready to go, as they say, over the top and go through the minefields and the machine guns and all that.
Through the barbed wire. Yeah.
You got to be saying to yourself, holy crap, did I get this wrong? And
yeah, exactly. And I mean, this is the thing that, even myself, my father joined immediately when World War II started. He signed up in Montreal, and off he went and experienced another war. And even with myself, what happened to me is when I was young, when I was 7, my sister and I and my mother went to England, and I met a cousin who was a grown man by that time, and he was a sailor. And he became my hero. And I decided at that time, when I was 7 years old, I'm going to be a sailor. And I went through the Cubs, I went through the Scouts, and then eventually I joined the Sea Cadets. And that's when I started actually training to become a sailor. And the interesting thing is, it's another interesting little episode in my life, is that while I was in the Sea Cadets, the St. Lawrence Seaway was opened. And the Queen Elizabeth, Eisenhower, Ike, and the Canadian Prime Minister was Diefenbaker, all converged on Montreal to open the Seaway. Now, as a Sea Cadet, they asked us we got our we were training in what they call cutters, whalers and cutters. These are boats that are all to this day are still used by the navies as boats to carry people to and from shore and that kind of thing. And our unit in Montreal was asked to get our cutter trimmed up, make it all beautiful, get into our best clothes, and go out to a place on the St. Lawrence River where the Queen's yacht was going to come and stop before she went on through the seaway, stop for a day, and a lot of very important people were going to arrive there and come on and had to get on board. And our job was to take them from shore to the Britannia, which was the royal yacht. So we did that, and it was my first real official experience, all dressed up in our whites and everything else, and taking these VIPs out to the Britannia, her yacht, and bringing them back to shore.
See, there again, Forrest Gump. Think of all the stories that you could create of taking dignitaries from the shore to the yacht and from the yacht to the shore and stuff.
Yeah.
By the way, we're talking with Michael Bergen. He has written 4 books, and it's called the Rutherford Chronicles. And you can go to his website, which is michaelbergen.com.
No, Michael G. Bergen.
Oh, you're right. There is a little G in there. Michael G. Bergen. And Bergen, and you can go look at all of his stuff, and you've got a short period of time. You got to read the first 3 books, and then the 4th book is coming out soon. So
it'll be out now.
Yeah, you got to order all 4 of them. So we need to take a real quick break, and we're going to come back. We're talking about elder abuse here, so for you and me, that's kind of important. So we'll be right back.
Okay.
A lifetime of savings can disappear overnight. Millions of dollars are stolen every day from unsuspecting older adults by family members, caregivers, and trusted professionals. If you suspect financial exploitation, call the Elder Care Locator at 1-800-677-1116 or go online to the National Adult Protective Services Association to be connected with help in your area.
And welcome back to Positive Talk with Kevin McDonald. Yes, and protect your mom and dad and their assets, because you never know. It could end up being your assets if you play your cards right. But anyway, we're talking with Michael Bergen, and go to his website, michaelgbergen.com. He's written the 4 books, Rutherford Chronicles. By the way, you've got the 4th one. It's just now. Do you feel like your mission is done? Or are you going to pick something else to write about, or is there a 5th book in the series?
There is a fifth book in the. I'm far into the 5th book, but before I get to that, I just want to mention one thing that I think is quite important. Please. History books can be quite boring, quite dull for a lot of people. Okay, so what I've tried to do in all of my books is to make it a story. So it's a story about, as you mentioned right up front, ordinary people getting involved in extraordinary circumstances. So it's always there's a lot of history, but there's also a story about real people all the way through this series. And I'm the real person in the last one, along with my grandfather, who was also involved in the very in a way, because he was still alive when I was in the Navy, and I had a last session with him in Croydon before he died. And so this fifth book. All right, I think I mentioned up front that I'm about 2/3 Celtic origin, Scottish basically, and 1/3 Scandinavian, Viking background. So my 5th book is about that, but it's got a bit of fantasy in it. So it introduces, first of all, some of the mythological characters, mainly from Ireland, but also from Scotland, and animals also, creatures. So it carries through the whole history of 2 millennia of Scottish and Irish history and the main characters that were involved all the way through that history. And then it picks up with my clans, which were the McCrae clan, which started in about 1300 roundabout, and the Rutherford clan. The McCrae clan is a Highland clan, and the Rutherford clan is a lowlands clan. So it brings in those two histories into it and tells how they came about. And so that's the fifth book, which I'm still working on, and it's so much fun. I mean, I really enjoyed that.
Didn't you tell me that those two clans went to war with the MacDonald clan?
Correct. Well, not the Rutherfords, but the McCraes. And in fact, I was just adding another one today. There was a lot of strife. The McCraes became the what do they call them? Basically the constables of a castle, a Mackenzie Castle in the north of Scotland, which is called Eilean Donan Castle. Now, it's probably the best known castle in Scotland and the one most visited by tourists. It's a small castle out on a lake, on a tiny island in the lake, right in the north, close to Loch Ailsh, the Kyle of Loch Ailsh. And so they were the constables. So they were protectors of the Mackenzies in that particular castle. So it talks all about that. And the MacDonalds were mainly on Skye and on some of the other islands. In fact, they were the chief of the islands and what have you. So that history all comes into it, and there were battles between them. One of my ancestors actually shot a MacDonald through the leg, who was attacking Eilean Donan Castle. He got an arrow right through the leg, and then the MacDonald pulled the arrow out of his leg and bled to death.
See, we're tough that way.
So that's the way wars were handled in those days. Lots of arrows and swords and axes. It was all easy stuff until it got through a little bit later. And the final battle that I cover in it was Culloden. And some people, especially people who have a Scottish background, know of the Battle of Culloden, which was in 1746. And that was the final blow where the British knocked the hell out of the Highlanders and basically sent them packing. And there hasn't been another battle on British soil since then.
Well, so let's hope that we don't have any more of that. Huh? Let's hope that we don't have any more battles.
No.
Because one of the things I like about, and the underlying theme of the work that you do is that war can be romanticized, but it really is a down and dirty, bloody, awful business.
Brutal.
So many people get killed and stuff. By the way, we have been talking with Michael Bergen. Go to his website, michaelgbergen.com. Sir, we've got about 30 seconds. Anything you'd like to add in 30 seconds?
I don't think so. I think I've added everything, but I want to say that I'm very impressed with your mission, which is the positive aspects of life and how to get across positive messages to people. That really impresses me, and I really wish you well with that.
Well, I really appreciate it, Michael, because I really like I love talking about history, and I love having people like you on. So it's great fun. Get the books, the Rutherford Chronicles. Go to his website, michaelgbergen.com. Michael, got to run, but I want to thank you so much for being here. When your fifth book comes out, you're going to have to come back because we're going to have to talk about the McDonald's and stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
I wish I had an Irish accent that made sense. Anyway,
thank you. Thank you, Kevin. It's been fun. Really interesting. Thank you.
Good. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening to this episode of Positive Talk with Kevin McDonald. Our purpose is to provide everyone with a positive, entertaining, and educational experience. I would love your feedback and comments about the show, including possible topics and great guest suggestions. Please email me at kevin@kmmedia.pro. And remember, be kind to one another because each other's all we've got. That's Kevin